All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really intense, provocative framework developed by Rev Dr Antonio Arnold. This is essentially a strategic briefing, specifically designed for Christian community leaders who are trying to navigate some incredibly complex modern cultural waters. Through his writings and broadcasts, Dr. Arnold draws this stark, direct line between the ancient biblical destruction of cities like Sodom and Gomorrah and the rapidly accelerating societal trends we're living through right now.
And it all starts with his core thesis, which is perfectly captured in this really heavy theological warning. He argues that the unrepentant sins of the ancient world haven't just, reappeared. They've actually taken root and assumed power across modern Western institutions. And perhaps the most critical part for the leaders targeted by this briefing, he asserts that the modern church has largely just remained silent while this shift happens.
What's fascinating is that Dr. Arnold doesn't just treat these ancient accounts as metaphors or fables. He anchors his whole analysis in the historical and archaeological reality of urban collapse. He views the fiery destruction of those ancient Near Eastern cities as a literal, historical symbol of divine judgment against unrepentant societal sin. It's a historical precedent that he believes serves as a massive flashing warning sign for us today.
So here's our roadmap for the explainer today. 1. Ancient collapse and divine warnings. 2. The timeline of moral decline. 3. Bureaucracy as secular authority. 4. Institutional decay in youth. 5. Secular versus biblical ideology. And 6. Strategies for church leadership.
Starting off with Section 1, Ancient Collapse and Divine Warnings, Lessons from the Dead Sea.
To back up that Genesis 19 account of divine judgment, Dr. Arnold points straight to the physical evidence. We're talking about archaeological excavations down near the Dead Sea at sites like Bab Edra and Gomorrah. These were incredibly prosperous urban centers that suffered a sudden, catastrophic abandonment. He contrasts the biblical accounts of city destruction with this real, physical evidence of ancient Near Eastern urban collapse to argue that these were real places facing real devastating consequences. But you have to understand, his analysis of Sodom isn't limited to just sexual ethics. While he absolutely emphasizes sexual immorality and pride based on texts like Romans 1 and Leviticus, he points out that the biblical text reveals a much broader, systemic moral decay. It was a culture defined by extreme inhospitality, total injustice, and the ruthless exploitation of the vulnerable. It was, in his view, a complete societal rejection of divine law across the board.
Moving right along to Section 2, the timeline of moral decline, ancient judgment to modern mandates. If we trace Dr. Arnold's perspective chronologically, he basically links that ancient judgment in Genesis to a modern downward spiral that he says really started accelerating in the 1980s. From there, he maps this steady moral decline straight into the 2020s, which culminates in contemporary government mandates surrounding inclusion. And he views those mandates not as societal progress, but actually as a regression right back to the exact conditions of ancient Sodom.
Which brings us to Section 3, Bureaucracy as Secular Authority, the Institutional Capture.
Under his framework, modern inclusivity, diversity, and equity offices function as a powerful secular authority. And he uses some incredibly strong language here. He literally refers to them as a modern Gestapo. He argues that these administrative bodies entrenched inside our government, our schools, and even the military are actively enforcing secular compliance. They're essentially acting as the new arbiters of morality, actively replacing divine law in the public square.
And this gets to the absolute core of his argument. He sees a direct, totally irreconcilable clash between adhering to traditional divine law and complying with modern state mandates. Think about it. Where divine law requires obedience to biblical truth and demands repentance, Dr. Arnold argues that modern state mandates demand compliance with secular inclusion. This often forces religious leaders into a corner, making them choose between their deeply held faith and their social standing.
All right, Part 4, Institutional Decay and Youth, Protecting the Next Generation.
Dr. Arnold issues a severe, urgent warning to parents and church leaders about what this means for the next generation. He points directly at public schools and academic institutions as epicenters of this decay, arguing they're substituting traditional values with secular ideologies. He calls out efforts to rewrite the Bible with inclusive language as a total distortion of truth. On top of that, he warns that exposing youth to radical orientations is deliberately eroding traditional family structures and stripping away parental authority. The urgency in his voice is just impossible to miss here. Taking on a highly serious tone, Dr. Arnold warns that modern culture is actively coming for the minds and identities of the next generation. For him, this is the breaking point. It's a literal call to arms for families to step up and protect their children from what he views as state-sponsored indoctrination. Moving to Section 5, Secular versus Biblical Ideology, the Clash of Worldviews.
When you lay it out side by side, the contrast between society's current values and Dr. Arnold's traditional interpretation is staggering. Where modern secular ideology celebrates Pride Month and absolute tolerance, Dr. Arnold sees an ancient warning of unrepentant sin. While the culture promotes a God is love message with zero accountability, he points straight to Romans 1, emphasizing righteous judgment and wrath. It's a fundamental clash between focusing on human autonomy versus focusing entirely on the Creator.
Finally, Section 6, Strategies for Church Leadership, a Call to Action. Now, before he lays out his solutions, Dr. Arnold heavily criticizes the current state of the modern church. He doesn't hold back. He argues that so many leaders have just stayed silent on these massive cultural shifts simply to protect their 501c3 tax-exempt status. He actually accuses religious leaders of prioritizing their popularity, their paychecks, and their social acceptability over biblical truth, pointing specifically to major denominations that have compromised by officially blessing unbiblical relationships.
So what's the game plan for leaders to preserve traditional values in these secular spaces? Step 1. Boldly preach repentance and biblical truth in the public square. Step 2. Completely refuse secular financial incentives, even if it means losing that tax-exempt status. Step 3 requires drawing some hard boundaries. You have to separate from parishes or institutions endorsing unbiblical doctrines. And finally, Step 4, act as uncompromising role models at home to protect that core family structure.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a deeply provocative thought drawn straight from his work. At this massive cultural crossroads, how will your church respond? Will modern religious communities simply adapt to survive under secular state mandates? Or will they risk their popularity, their funding, and their status to stand firm on ancient biblical truth? It's an incredibly challenging question for every community leader out there. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.